The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of the gates of Trajan like shrouds of the dead, and young Emperor Basil II should have taken it as an omen. The year was 980, and the 28-year-old ruler of the Byzantine Empire stood at the edge of destiny, gazing through the narrow mountain pass that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires for centuries. The gates themselves, massive stone fortifications built by the Roman Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century, loomed before his army like the jaws of some primordial beast, their weathered surfaces bearing the scars of 1,000 battles. Behind him stretched the greatest military force the Byzantine Empire had assembled in decades, 20,000 men in gleaming mail and purple-dyed cloaks, their spears creating a forest of steel that caught the early light like silver fire. The Scalae Palatine, the elite palace guard, rode their war horses with practiced ease, their golden standards fluttering in the mountain breeze. Alongside them marched the theme armies from Anatolia and Macedonia, seasoned veterans who had defended the empire's borders for years. The young emperor had spent months preparing for this campaign, driven by the burning desire to crush the Bulgarian uprising that had plagued his reign since its inception. Basil turned to his strategist, the aged General Knight, whose weathered face bore the lines of countless campaigns. "The scouts report no movement beyond the gates," the emperor said, his voice carrying the confidence of youth and inexperience. "Samuel's forces have withdrawn deeper into Bulgarian territory. We shall pass through unopposed." Arenas studied the narrow defile with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 40 years of warfare. Something in the silence of the mountain pass troubled him. It was too quiet, too perfect. The Bulgarian Tsar Samuel was known for his cunning, not his cowardice. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain as the Byzantine army began its advance into the pass. The gates of Trajan had been carved from the living rock of the Srednagora mountains, creating a natural bottleneck that had served as both fortress and trap for nearly a millennium. Roman engineers had enhanced the natural defenses with walls and towers, but centuries of weather and warfare had reduced many of these to rubble. Still, the pass remained a formidable obstacle, its walls rising nearly 200 feet on either side, creating a corridor barely wide enough for 100 men to march abreast. As the vanguard entered the gates, the sound of hoofbeats and marching feet echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off the ancient stone walls with an almost musical quality. The air grew cooler in the shadow of the mountains, and many of the soldiers pulled their cloaks tighter against the chill. Above them, eagles circled in the narrow strip of sky visible between the towering cliffs, their cries adding an eerie counterpoint to the steady rhythm of the march. According to historical accounts preserved in the chronicles of the time, as documented by medieval historians, the Byzantine army had been lured into what would become one of the most decisive ambushes in medieval warfare. The emperor's confidence in his overwhelming numerical superiority would prove to be his greatest weakness, for Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria had prepared a trap that would echo through the ages. The Bulgarian forces, numbering perhaps 8,000 men, had spent days positioning themselves in hidden positions along the cliffs and among the ruins of the ancient fortifications. The first sign of trouble came when the Byzantine advance guard, led by the young noble Constantine Diogenes, suddenly found their path blocked by a massive wall of fallen stones. The rockfall appeared natural at first glance, but experienced eyes might have noticed the precise way the boulders had been arranged to create an impenetrable barrier. Behind them, the main body of the army continued to pour into the pass, unaware that they were marching into a carefully constructed killing ground. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed toward its zenith, the air within the gates of Trajan grew thick with dust and the smell of sweat and steel. The confined space began to feel oppressive, and nervous murmurs rippled through the ranks as word spread of the obstruction ahead. Emperor Basil, still confident in his overwhelming advantage, ordered his engineers forward to clear the path. They worked with desperate efficiency, their tools ringing against stone as they struggled to create a passage through the debris. The engineering corps labored under the blazing sun that had climbed to its zenith, their bronze tools sparking against the cunningly placed stones that blocked the narrow passage. Emperor Basil II paced restlessly among his officers, his purple cloak swirling with each agitated turn. The delay gnawed at him like a physical pain every moment. They remained trapped in this corridor of stone, brought them closer to the onset of the brutal Balkan winter, when campaigning would become impossible. How much longer? The emperor demanded of his chief engineer, a grizzled veteran named Kallinikos, who had served under 3 previous emperors. The man wiped sweat from his brow with a cloth stained black with stone dust and shook his head grimly. "The stones are placed with purpose, Majesty. Each one we remove causes others to shift. It will take hours, perhaps a full day." Around them, the massive Byzantine army had ground to a halt, 20,000 men compressed into a space meant for a fraction of that number. The Bulgarian Tsar Samuel crouched among the ruins of an ancient watchtower, his keen eyes surveying the trapped Byzantine forces far below. At 47 years of age, he was a man hardened by decades of warfare against the empire that had once ruled his homeland. His weathered hands gripped the hilt of his sword as he watched the enemy engineers work frantically to clear the obstruction. Beside him, his most trusted general, Gavril, counted the enemy's standards with the practiced eye of a professional soldier. "They have brought their entire strength," Radomir whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind whistling through the mountain peaks. "The theme armies of Anatolia and Macedonia, the Scarli, Palatinae, even the Varangian Guard. Basil stakes everything on this single campaign." Samuel nodded slowly, his mind calculating the implications. The young Byzantine emperor had indeed committed his empire's military might to this venture, leaving his other frontiers dangerously exposed. From their concealed positions among the cliffs and ruins, 8,000 Bulgarian warriors waited with the patience of hunters. They had been selected for this mission not just for their skill with sword and spear, but for their ability to remain motionless and silent for hours at a time. Many were veterans of the border wars that had raged for decades, men who had learned to read the subtle signs of terrain and whether that could mean the difference between victory and death. The sun reached its apex and began its slow descent toward the western peaks, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Within the pass, the temperature had become stifling, and many of the Byzantine soldiers had removed their helmets and loosened their mail shirts. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the packed earth, and the smell of dust and sweat grew overwhelming. Water discipline became crucial as the men shared their meager supplies, knowing that the nearest reliable source lay beyond the blocked passage. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll on the engineering crews. Their initial enthusiasm had given way to grim determination, then to desperate fatigue. The stones seemed to multiply with each one they removed, and the passage remained stubbornly blocked. Emperor Basil's frustration mounted with each passing hour, his youthful impatience warring with the advice of his more experienced generals who counseled patience and caution. General Nikephoros Uranus approached the emperor as the shadows began to lengthen. "Majesty, we should consider withdrawal. The men are tired, their formations are compressed, and we know nothing of the enemy's disposition. This place makes me uneasy." The old general's words carried the weight of decades of experience, but they fell on deaf ears. Basil had staked his reputation on this campaign, and the thought of retreat before even engaging the enemy was intolerable. "We press forward," the emperor declared, his voice carrying across the narrow confines of the pass. "Samuel's rabble cannot stand against the might of Rome reborn. We shall clear this obstruction and continue our advance." His words were met with dutiful cheers from his officers, but many of the veteran soldiers exchanged worried glances. They had seen the aftermath of overconfidence before, and the memory of fallen comrades haunted their thoughts. High above, concealed among the ancient stones and scrub brush, Bulgarian archers checked their bowstrings and counted their arrows. Each man carried a quiver of 30 shafts, enough to rain death upon the trapped enemy below. Their bows were the traditional composite weapons of the steppe peoples, shorter than the great yew longbows of the north but capable of penetrating mail at close range. The sound of their preparations was masked by the constant noise rising from the pass below. As evening approached, the work continued by torchlight, casting dancing shadows on the ancient walls. The flickering flames created an almost hellish atmosphere within the pass, and more than one soldier muttered prayers to his patron saint. The trapped army began to show signs of strained tempers flared over minor disputes, and the officers worked constantly to maintain discipline among the increasingly restless troops. The first arrow struck without warning, its iron point finding the gap between helmet and mail coif of a Byzantine engineer. The man pitched forward with a surprised grunt, his blood spreading across the pale stone like spilled wine. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended in perfect silence. Then the sky above, the gates of Trajan erupted in a whistling storm of death that would give the battle its name in the chronicles of ages to come. Samuel's voice rang out like thunder from the heights. For Bulgaria, for freedom. 8,000 Bulgarian warriors rose from their concealment as one, their war cries echoing from the stone walls in a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The ambush had been prepared with meticulous care, every angle of fire calculated, every escape route blocked, every weakness in the Byzantine formation identified and exploited. The arrows fell like deadly rain, each shaft guided by the skilled hands of men who had hunted in these mountains since childhood. The Byzantine soldiers, packed together like sheep in a pen, had nowhere to run and little room to raise their shields. The narrow confines of the pass, which had seemed like a mere inconvenience minutes before, now became a death trap of unimaginable proportions. Men screamed in pain and terror as the iron-tipped shafts found their marks, piercing mail and flesh with equal ease. Emperor Basil II stood frozen in the chaos, his young mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. The purple cloak that marked him as sovereign of the greatest empire in the world now made him a target for every Bulgarian archer who could draw a bow. His personal guard, the Scarli Palatini, formed a protective circle around him, their shields raised in a desperate attempt to ward off the falling death. "Shields up, form testudo," the commands of veteran officers cut through the screams and confusion. But the traditional Roman formations were nearly impossible to execute in the confined space. The men struggled to lock their shields together while arrows continued to fall from above, each volley claiming dozens of lives. The wounded cried out for help that could not reach them, their voices adding to the cacophony of battle. From his position among the ruins, Tsar Samuel watched the destruction with grim satisfaction. This was not merely a military victory, it was vengeance for decades of Byzantine oppression. For the villages burned and the people enslaved, his archers maintained their deadly rhythm, each man loosing his arrows with practiced precision. Before ducking back into cover to avoid the few Byzantine missiles that managed to reach the heights, the engineering equipment so carefully brought to clear the path now became obstacles as desperate men sought any shelter from the storm of arrows. Heavy wooden beams and bronze tools were pressed into service as makeshift shields, while the wounded crawled beneath overturned carts and scattered supplies. The blocked passage, which had seemed like a temporary setback, now trapped them like animals in a slaughter pen. General Nikiforos Ouranos, his decades of experience finally proving their worth, managed to organize a fighting retreat toward the mouth of the pass. He bellowed, his voice carrying over the chaos. Fighting withdraw. Protect the wounded. His orders were taken up by other officers, and slowly, painfully, the Byzantine army began to extract itself from the killing ground. But retreat was nearly as deadly as remaining. The mouth of the pass, which had seemed so welcoming hours before, now appeared impossibly distant. Every step backward was paid for in blood as the Bulgarian archers adjusted their aim to follow the retreating targets. The disciplined formations that had entered the gates of Trajan with such confidence were now reduced to a mob of desperate men fighting for their lives. The young emperor's horse, a magnificent white stallion that had been a gift from the Patriarch of Constantinople, reared in terror as an arrow grazed its flank. Basil fought to control the animal, while his guards struggled to maintain their protective formation. The imperial standard, the golden eagle of Rome that had flown over 1,000 battlefields, was torn from its bearer's hands by a lucky shot and trampled underfoot by the retreating army. As the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky above the pass, the true scope of the disaster became clear. The greatest military force that the Byzantine Empire had assembled in decades was being systematically destroyed by a smaller force of Bulgarian warriors using nothing more than bows and the advantages of terrain. The chroniclers would later write that this was the moment when the sky itself seemed to turn to flame. As the setting sun painted the ancient stones crimson with reflected light and spilled blood, the retreat became a rout as darkness fell across the gates of Trajan like a funeral shroud. The Byzantine army, once the terror of the known world, now fled in panic through the narrow mountain pass while Bulgarian war cries echoed from the heights like the voices of avenging spirits. Emperor Basil II, his purple cloak torn and stained with blood both his own and that of his men, clung to his wounded horse as his personal guard fought desperately to clear a path through the chaos. The Scali Palatani, those elite warriors who had sworn to die before allowing harm to come to their emperor, paid the ultimate price for their loyalty. One by one, they fell to the ceaseless rain of arrows, their golden armor providing little protection against the deadly accuracy of the Bulgarian archers. Captain Theophanes, a giant of a man who had served 3 emperors, took an arrow through the throat but continued to fight, his voice reduced to a bloody whisper as he urged his men to protect their sovereign. The emperor must not fall. General Nikiforos Ouranos shouted over the din of battle, his own sword red with the blood of Bulgarian warriors who had descended from the heights to finish the work their arrows had begun. The old general had seen enough disasters to know that some battles could not be won, only survived. His priority now was saving what remained of the army and ensuring that the empire would have a ruler to return to Constantinople. The blocked passage that had started this nightmare now became a blessing in disguise, for it prevented the Bulgarians from bringing cavalry into the pass to complete the slaughter. But Samuel's warriors needed no horses to do their deadly work. They scrambled down the cliff faces like mountain goats, their curved swords gleaming in the torchlight as they fell upon the trapped Byzantines. With all the fury of men fighting for their homeland's freedom, young Constantine Diogenes, who had led the advance guard with such confidence that morning, now fought a desperate rearguard action to buy time for his emperor's escape. His men, the flower of the Anatolian theme, died around him with the stoic courage that had made the Byzantine army legendary. They formed a shield wall across the narrow passage, their spears thrust forward like the spines of some great beast, while arrows continued to fall from above. As documented in the Byzantine chronicles of the period, the battle reached its climax when Tsar Samuel himself descended from the heights to lead a final assault. The Bulgarian ruler, his sword dripping with Byzantine blood, carved a path through the packed ranks of his enemies like a man possessed. His personal guard, the boyar, heavy cavalry, had dismounted to fight on foot in the confined space, their 200 swords cleaving through mail and bone with terrifying efficiency. The imperial standards, those sacred symbols of Roman power that had flown over victories from Britain to Mesopotamia, were torn down and trampled in the mud. The golden eagle of the Scali Palatine, which had never before been captured in battle, was seized by a Bulgarian warrior who held it aloft like a trophy while his comrades cheered. The psychological impact of seeing their sacred symbols desecrated was almost as devastating to the Byzantine troops as the physical casualties they had sustained. Emperor Basil, protected by the last remnants of his guard, finally reached the mouth of the pass as the moon rose over the battlefield. Behind him, the gates of Trajan were littered with the bodies of his army, their armor glinting in the pale light like scattered coins. The young emperor's face was ashen with shock and exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his forces. "How many?" he whispered to General Laranus, who had somehow managed to survive the slaughter. The old general's reply was barely audible over the screams of the wounded and the distant sounds of Bulgarian celebration. "Perhaps 5. Majesty, perhaps fewer. Out of 20,000 men, fewer than a quarter had escaped the trap. The rest lay dead or dying in the pass, their blood seeping into the ancient stones that had witnessed so many previous battles." The pursuit continued through the night as Samuel's forces harried the fleeing Byzantines across the Bulgarian countryside. The emperor's army, once a disciplined force capable of conquering nations, had been reduced to scattered bands of survivors fleeing for their lives. Many would not reach the safety of the empire's borders, falling to Bulgarian patrols or dying of their wounds in the wilderness. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the true scope of the disaster became clear. The gates of Trajan, which had stood as a symbol of Roman might for 8 centuries, were now a monument to Byzantine defeat. The strategic implications were staggering. The empire's military strength had been shattered in a single day, its young emperor's reputation destroyed, and its enemies emboldened by the sight of Roman eagles trampled in the mud. The carrion birds arrived with the dawn, their black wings casting shadows across the field of the dead as they settled among the corpses littering the gates of Trajan. The ancient stones, weathered by 8 centuries of wind and rain, were now stained with the blood of 20,000 men, creating a crimson tapestry that would haunt the dreams of survivors for decades to come. The narrow pass had been transformed into a charnel house, its walls echoing with the groans of the wounded and the cries of scavengers picking through the remains of what had once been the greatest army in the Christian world. Emperor Basil II sat hunched on a boulder outside the pass, his imperial purple cloak wrapped around him like a shroud. The young ruler's face bore the hollow look of a man who had seen his dreams shattered in a single day, his confident smile replaced by the grim mask of bitter experience. Around him, the pitiful remnants of his army, perhaps 4,000 men out of the 20,000 who had entered the pass, ended their wounds and counted their losses with the stunned silence of survivors. General Nicephorus Ouranos, his weathered face bearing fresh scars from the battle, approached his emperor with the measured steps of a man bearing terrible news. "Majesty, we have counted the standards. The Scalae Palatinea destroyed Captain Theophanes and all his men lie dead in the pass. The Anatolian theme has lost 3/4 of its strength, and the Macedonian theme fares a little better. We have no siege equipment, no supplies, and winter approaches." The old general's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of despair that spread through the assembled officers. From within the pass came the sound of Bulgarian voices raised in victory songs, their ancient melodies echoing from the stone walls in a haunting counterpoint to the cries of the wounded. Tsar Samuel had achieved what no enemy of Rome had accomplished in centuries: the complete destruction of an imperial army without the loss of a single major battle. The strategic implications were staggering, for the defeat had opened the heart of the empire to Bulgarian raids and emboldened every enemy from the Danube to the Euphrates. The wounded presented the most immediate crisis. Hundreds of men lay scattered across the battlefield, their injuries ranging from minor cuts to mortal wounds that would claim their lives within hours. The army's medical corps had been decimated along with the rest of the force, leaving only a handful of surgeons to tend the multitude of casualties. Many of the wounded would have to be left behind, their fate sealed by the simple mathematics of survival. Young Constantine Diogenes, who had led the advance guard with such confidence, now lay among the dead inside the pass, his body pierced by a dozen arrows. His death symbolized the fate of an entire generation. Byzantine officers who had grown up hearing tales of their ancestors' victories, but had never faced the reality of total defeat. The loss of such experienced commanders would weaken the empire's military effectiveness for years to come. The local Bulgarian population, emboldened by their army's victory, began to emerge from their hiding places in the mountains. These were the people who had suffered under Byzantine rule for generations. Their villages burned and their young men pressed into service in the imperial armies. Now they looked upon the defeated Romans with a mixture of triumph and barely contained hatred, their eyes reflecting the accumulated grievances of decades. According to the account preserved in the Chronicle of Jonska, a contemporary Byzantine historian, the defeat at the gates of Trajan marked the beginning of a new era in the relationship between the empire and its Balkan neighbors. The aura of Roman invincibility, carefully cultivated through centuries of military success, had been shattered in a single day, revealing the empire's vulnerabilities to friend and foe alike. The retreat to Constantinople would become a nightmare of its own. As the scattered remnants of the army struggled across hostile territory with winter approaching, Many units simply dissolved, their men deserting to return to their homes rather than face the shame of reporting their defeat to the capital. The roads leading back to the empire were littered with abandoned equipment and the bodies of men who had succumbed to their wounds or the hardships of the journey. Emperor Basil himself barely escaped capture when a Bulgarian patrol nearly intercepted his party near the town of Mel. The young emperor, who had dreamed of rivaling the conquests of his predecessors, now found himself fleeing through the night like a common fugitive. The psychological impact of this humiliation would shape his character for the rest of his life, transforming him from an idealistic young ruler into the iron-willed warrior, who would later earn the epithet Bulgar. The news of the disaster reached Constantinople like a thunderbolt, spreading panic throughout the capital as citizens contemplated the implications of their emperor's defeat. The city's churches filled with worshippers praying for the souls of the dead and the safety of the empire, while the Senate convened an emergency session to address the crisis. Many began to whisper that the defeat was divine punishment for the empire's sins, a theme that would echo through Byzantine literature for generations. The Bulgarian victory celebrations continued for days, as news of the triumph spread throughout the Balkan Peninsula. Tsar Samuel had not merely won a battle, he had struck a blow for Bulgarian independence that would resonate through the ages. The captured Byzantine standards were displayed in the Bulgarian capital of Oru, while the weapons and armor of the dead were redistributed to Samuel's followers, strengthening his army for future campaigns. The bitter winter of 986 descended upon the Byzantine Empire like a judgment from heaven, its icy winds carrying whispers of disaster from the Bulgarian frontier to the marble halls of Constantinople. The capital, once secure in its confidence of imperial invincibility, now trembled with each rumor from the north. As citizens gathered in the forums and churches to debate the implications of their young emperor's catastrophic defeat at the gates of Trajan, Emperor Basil II had returned to his capital a changed man, his youthful arrogance replaced by a grim understanding of the realities of war. The purple-clad figure who had ridden north with such confidence now walked the corridors of the great palace with the measured steps of a man who had looked death in the face and barely escaped its embrace. His courtiers, once eager to curry favor with the conquering hero they had expected him to become, now watched him with barely concealed concern, wondering if the disaster had broken his spirit entirely. The strategic consequences of the defeat rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The theme system, the military organization that had protected the empire's borders for centuries, lay in ruins across the Balkans. The Anatolian theme, which had provided the backbone of imperial defense for generations, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Entire military districts found themselves stripped of their veteran soldiers, their defenses manned by raw recruits and aging reservists, who had never faced serious combat. In the monasteries and scriptoriums of the empire, chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe the magnitude of the disaster. The defeat at the gates of Trajan was not merely a military setback, it was a psychological earthquake that shook the very foundations of Byzantine identity. For centuries, the empire had defined itself as the heir to Rome, the divinely appointed guardian of Christian civilization. How could such a power be humbled by a barbarian people fighting for their independence? The Bulgarian Tsar Samuel Mawa had become a figure of legend throughout the Balkans. His victory had not merely established Bulgarian independence, it had created a new paradigm of power in southeastern Europe. The scattered Bulgarian tribes, long divided by geography and political rivalries, now rallied to his banner with an enthusiasm born of newfound confidence. The empire that had once seemed invincible now appeared vulnerable, its armies defeated and its emperor in flight. The economic impact of the disaster was equally devastating. The imperial treasury, already strained by the costs of the campaign, now faced the additional burden of rebuilding the shattered army. The themed soldiers who had perished in the past had been not merely warriors, but also farmers and craftsmen, their deaths creating labor shortages that would affect agricultural production for years to come. The tribute that had once flowed from the Balkans to Constantinople now went to fund Samuel's war effort instead. Religious leaders throughout the empire struggled to interpret the defeat in theological terms. Some saw it as divine punishment for the empire's sins, pointing to the moral corruption of the court and the neglect of Christian duties. Others argued that it was a test of faith, a trial sent by God to purify the empire and prepare it for greater glory. The debates raged in the churches and monasteries, adding a spiritual dimension to the political crisis that had engulfed the state. The defeat also had profound implications for the empire's relationship with its other neighbors. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, long held in check by the threat of Byzantine retaliation, now began to probe the empire's Syrian defenses with renewed aggression. The Rus princes along the Black Sea, who had recently converted to Christianity and allied themselves with Constantinople, began to question the wisdom of their new faith's political implications. Even the Italian city-states nominally under Byzantine protection started to explore alternative arrangements for their security. Emperor Basil, isolated in his defeat and haunted by the memory of his fallen soldiers, began to plan his revenge with the methodical precision of a man who had learned from bitter experience. The young emperor who had rushed into battle with dreams of easy conquest was gone, replaced by a calculating strategist who understood that wars were won not by single battles but by sustained campaigns of attrition. He would spend the next 15 years rebuilding his army and preparing for the day when he would return to the Balkans to settle accounts with Samuel. The transformation of the emperor's character became a subject of fascination for court observers, where once he had been quick to anger and impulsive in his decisions, he now displayed a patience that bordered on the supernatural. He spent hours studying military manuals and consulting with a few surviving veterans of the disaster, learning from their experiences and incorporating their hard-won wisdom into his plans for the future. The defeat had aged him beyond his years, but it had also forged him into a weapon of remarkable effectiveness. The Bulgarian victory at the gates of Trajan would ultimately prove to be both a triumph and a curse for Samuel's people. While the immediate result was independence and increased power, the long-term consequences would be far more complex. The defeat had not destroyed the Byzantine Empire, it had merely wounded it, creating a thirst for revenge that would consume the Balkans for the next generation. The young emperor who had fled the battlefield would return as Basil, the Bulgar slayer, and his vengeance would be terrible indeed. 34 years after the catastrophe at the gates of Trajan, an aging Byzantine soldier named Theophanes the Younger stood once more among the ancient stones where his father had died. The year was 1020, and the wheel of fortune had turned full circle, bringing the empire back to the scene of its greatest humiliation in a final act of retribution that would echo through the centuries. The young man who had fled these mountains in defeat had returned as Basil the Bulgar slayer, and his army carried with it the accumulated fury of a generation. The gates of Trajan bore little resemblance to the blood-soaked battlefield of 980. Time and weather had scoured the stones clean, but the memories lingered like ghosts in the mountain air. The narrow pass, once choked with the bodies of 20,000 Byzantine soldiers, now witnessed the methodical advance of a new imperial army, its discipline and organization reflecting the hard-learned lessons of that earlier disaster. Emperor Basil, now in his 62nd year, rode through the pass with the measured dignity of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. His hair had turned white in the service of the empire, and his face bore the lines of countless campaigns, but his eyes still burned with the fire of that young emperor who had once fled these stones in shame. The purple cloak that had been torn and bloodied in defeat now flew proudly in the mountain breeze, a symbol of imperial power restored. The Bulgarian resistance had finally been broken at the Battle of Kledia, where Basil had captured 15,000 enemy soldiers and ordered them blinded, all save one in every 100, who was left with a single eye to guide his companions home. The sight of those mutilated warriors had broken Tsar Samuel's spirit, and the Bulgarian king had died shortly afterward. Some said of grief and shock. The victory had been complete, but it had come at a cost that would haunt the region for generations. The transformation of the Byzantine Empire in the decades following the gates of Trajan had been nothing short of remarkable. The defeat had served as a catalyst for military and administrative reforms that strengthened the state far beyond its previous capabilities. The theme system had been reorganized, the army professionalized, and the empire's finances placed on a more secure footing. The humiliation of 986 had become the foundation of the empire's greatest period of expansion and prosperity. Yet the cost of victory could be measured not merely in gold and blood, but in the character of the empire itself. The young, idealistic Basil who had dreamed of easy conquest had been replaced by a ruthless pragmatist who understood that power was maintained through fear as much as loyalty. The empire that emerged from the Balkan Wars was stronger than ever, but it was also harder, more cynical, and less capable of inspiring the genuine loyalty that had once made it great. The local population, those Bulgarian peasants who had once cheered Samuel's victory, now watched the imperial procession with the sullen resignation of the defeated. The price of resistance had been made clear through decades of warfare, and the survivors understood that their independence had been purchased with the blood of their children. The mountains that had once echoed with songs of victory now seemed to weep with the memory of all that had been lost. Contemporary chronicles, including the detailed account preserved in the Strategikon, recorded that the final pacification of the Balkans had required not merely military victory, but also the systematic destruction of Bulgarian culture and identity. Churches were demolished, noble families were scattered, and the Bulgarian language was banned from official use. The empire that had once been content to rule through local proxies now demanded complete submission. The irony was not lost on those who understood the deeper currents of history. The defeat at the gates of Trajan had ultimately strengthened the Byzantine Empire by forcing it to confront its weaknesses and adapt to new realities. The price of that adaptation had been the transformation of the empire from a civilizing force into a military machine, efficient but lacking the moral authority that had once made it a beacon of hope in a dark world. As the imperial procession passed through the gates and began its descent toward Constantinople, the setting sun painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and crimson, creating an effect that observers would long remember. The sky seemed to burn with the same flame that had consumed the dreams of a young emperor 34 years earlier. But now that flame belonged to the empire itself, purified by defeat and hardened by victory. The Gates of Trajan would remain a symbol of the complex relationship between defeat and triumph, between the idealism of youth and the pragmatism of age. The battle that had once seemed like the end of the world had become the beginning of a new era, one in which the Byzantine Empire would reach heights of power and prosperity that its founders could never have imagined. Yet those who remembered the young emperor who had fled these mountains in defeat could not help but wonder whether the price of victory had been too high, and whether the empire that emerged from the flames was still worthy of the name it bore. The legacy of the Gates of Trajan would endure long after the last veteran of the campaign had passed into memory, a reminder that even the greatest disasters can become the foundation of future triumph, but only at a cost that transforms both victor and vanquished beyond recognition. In the end, the sky had indeed turned to flame, and from that flame had emerged an empire reborn, terrible in its power.